I'm very happy to present this commentary because I think it's very timely. Uh, because this nature restoration regulation will now be subject for all member states of the European Union. They are very busy for the next 6 months to draft their implementation plans, which they will submit to the Commission. So I think the next intensive in all member states discussing how and also with the Commission on the review of the implementation plans and how this regulation will develop over time. But we could start with asking the question why this is on the agenda and very high on the agenda. And I think there's one compelling reason, and that is that we have experienced a catastrophic loss of natural capital. And we look for the last 100 years or 150 years. This figure illustrates the change in biomass of living organisms on the planet. So humans and domesticated animals, which we depend on, have increased from about 50% of all the biomass to today 95%. And only 5% of the biomass on the planet are now represented by animals on land or in marine systems. So this is a very urgent issue for every country to address, but also in Europe, we need to address this really catastrophic development that there is a need now to try to restore at least some of this biomass, because there are consequences of losing that natural capital. And they are quite severe economic consequences. Here's one example just published by the World Bank in a report that was launched last week on how the GDP is affected by forest management through influencing rainfall. So, for example, changing rainfall could result in reduced agricultural yields. And that negative effect on GDP you could see is very large if you have a very fragmented forest, even if you have just a plantation. While where you have more species richness and more natural forest cover, the effect on GDP is much less negative effect on GDP in rainfall anomaly. So it is important, and it is important for member states' finance ministers to actually address this in many ways. So in our commentary, we have tried to summarize the rationale for why this nature restoration regulation is important. We believe it represents a strategic investment in security, prosperity, and ecological stability. They're quite ambitious targets. 20% of EU's land and sea areas should be restored by 2030. But there are potential very high benefits of this restoration effort. So there is a calculation by the Commission itself looking at impacts of this restoration regulation that over the coming decades, with an investment of 150 billion euros, we could generate benefits of 1,800 billion euros, which is an enormous amount of resource and wealth. So we start with the question, what is restoration? And here, I think it's important to point out that restoration is actions that restore vital functions of degraded ecosystems and not necessarily restoring just specific species competitions. In particular, given that we will have shifting species distributions driven by climate change. So there is an emphasis on reviving ecological processes, such as grazing, fire regimes, or natural flooding, rather than merely reconstructing historical structures. Then we could ask, nature restoration regulation, what does it do? and in our view, it's an attempt, and it starts to outline means of compensating for current market failures and particularly addressing an equal sharing of costs and benefits and creating a regulatory overlay to limit the damage to society from actions that destroy or degrade nature. So this unequal sharing of cost and benefits is is a challenge, and I think this regulation is a start to and aiming to address this. That, for example, the exploitation of natural resources, the benefits of that are usually flowing to individual, for example, the individual landowner, while the costs of exploitation in the form of degraded habitats or pollution or flooding is often carried by the community and society. On the other hand, if you are restoring, the cost uh, is often carried or borne by the individual landowner, while the benefits are shared among the communities and societies. So there is a need for mechanisms to address this unequal sharing. And there are outlines in the regulation on mechanisms for that. For example, I mean, the established polluter pay principle, but there are also mechanisms around biocredits and of course, reforming the common agricultural policy to address this unequal sharing of costs and benefits. What we do in the commentary is building on recent reports where we actually addressed um, in different types of sectors of society the role of ecosystems and ecosystem services and restoration for maintaining, for example, carbon storage and water holding capacity and also agricultural or yields in different sectors. So, for example, in agriculture, we are experiencing a challenge in Europe of loss of soil and reduced carbon storage capacity, reduced water holding capacity, and loss of biodiversity. And as you can see on the figure here, we have over time, while intensifying uh, the use of the landscape, lost biodiversity, but we also lost some of the essential functions, particularly in soil. So the nature restoration regulation will be very essential in trying to reverse this trend and move this trend more to the left, where we reduce the intensification of agriculture. And we outlined that in a report published 2002 on regenerative agriculture, which actually has the capacity to restore soil organic matter, biodiversity, and improve water retention, and to different practices, and we went through the scientific literature evaluating these practices, where we found that they actually have a significant effect. Like, for example, diversified crop rotations, intercropping, cover crops and perennial crops, reduced tillage, agroforestry, and integrated pest management. We also make an overview of another important sector, which is the forest sector, where we currently in Europe have experiencing a severe challenge with the forest carbon sink is weakening due to, on the one hand, climate stress, but also to increased harvest pressure. So since 2010, we have actually experienced nearly a 30% reduction in the forest sink, partly due to increased harvest, but also partly due to effects of climate change and insect infestation and increased tree mortality across Europe. And the solution to this challenge would be to invest in restoration of mixed species and mixed age stands, adopting close to nature forestry and habitat protection. And one additional benefit of doing this will be to contribute to significantly reduce wildfire risk. And this was highlighted in a very recent report published in May this year, where we outline quite a large array of preventive measures to reduce wildfire risk. But we also would have a significant effect on carbon storage capacity in forests. Another important dimension of forest and carbon is, of course, when forests are used for bioenergy. And here we strongly argue that we should create much better incentives to prioritize cascading use of biomass. Instead of taking forest products and burning them directly, they should go through an extended life and reused and recycled before we burn the biomass, and it actually turns into carbon dioxide and going into the atmosphere. Another very low-hanging fruit when it comes to restoration is peatlands, where restoring drained peatlands will result in a rather direct and sharply cut rate of emissions, increased carbon storage, substantially lowered wildfire risk, improving water retention, and enhancing biodiversity. And as you see on this figure, wetlands constitute the major biome in the world, storing carbon, and particularly underground. There is an enormous amount of carbon stored underground, which, when it's drained, easily then is transformed and becoming carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This could be this effect could be reversed, at least partly, by re-wetting wetlands, and the wetlands could reduce the emissions and actually increase the carbon storage. And additionally, that would have effects on wildfire risk and enhancing biodiversity, and improve water retention as well. We also try to make an important point that this is not just about biodiversity and carbon. It's also about addressing disaster risks, which are increasing due to, for example, climate change. And we introduced the concept of preventive restoration, and we urge member states to start to implementing and mainstreaming preventive restoration in order to be proactive and reduce disaster risks. So, for example, when it comes to wildfires, and we outline that in that recent report that came this in May last year, that there are so many ways preventive restoration would reduce wildfire risk by restoring mixed species stands, restoring agro-silvopastoral systems, low flammability mosaics, and restoring peatlands, for examples. It's also true when it comes to flooding, to adopt more natural water retention measures, floodplain reconnection, restoring riparian buffers, improve soil health, restoring farm ponds, and also addressing urban areas and what's called urban sponge measures, which are ways with urban areas would reduce the impermeable surfaces and have more permeable surfaces that are better to handle water. Landslides and erosion, preventive restoration will also be quite important, restoring vegetation on slopes, forest restoration in critical zones, and restoring soil structure. Drought and heat, restoring soil organic matter through, for example, mulching, restore shaded riparian corridors, and restore and increase urban tree canopies. So, in summary, we believe that the nature restoration regulation represents a cost-effective opportunity for member states to regrow their natural capital. Implementing it, they should, number one, recognize and finance nature's strategic assets and valuing measurable public good outcomes, and addressing this unequal share of cost and benefits I talked about. Second, deliver cross-sectoral policy coherence and governance, aligning incentives and institutions, because here it's important to view the whole landscape, the agricultural, the forested, and the riparian landscapes as very integrated. And we also need to develop incentives and institutions that could handle these integrated landscapes. And thirdly, mainstream preventive restoration, invest ahead of crisis to secure resilience, fair transition, and autonomy.